Welcome to Mumblebee, where I mumble you into sleep with stories that drift like soft breezes through your mind. On this channel, my tales wander without direction, meandering through dreamy landscapes and carrying you gently away from the day's worries. So, close your eyes, relax, and let me guide you into the land of dreams, where the journey is just as important as the destination. This is The Wanderer's Dream. Chapter 1. The Path of Forgotten Steps. Once upon a time, or perhaps it was just yesterday, there was a traveler who had forgotten where they were going. The traveler didn't have a name, or maybe they had many names, but none of them seemed quite right. As they wandered, the sky above shifted colors. Sometimes it was a deep shade of blue, and other times it was a soft, misty gray, like the color of early morning fog that hasn't quite decided if it wants to lift. The path they walked on wasn't straight. It twisted and turned, sometimes doubling back on itself, and other times it seemed to vanish altogether, only to reappear a few steps later. The traveler didn't mind this. In fact, they found it rather pleasant, like a dance where you don't know the steps, but you follow along anyway, because the music is just too lovely to resist. The trees along the path were tall, or maybe they were short. They had leaves that fluttered down like whispers, soft and barely there, settling on the traveler's shoulders before disappearing again. The traveler noticed this, but didn't think much of it. After all, in a world where paths can disappear and reappear, leaves that vanish aren't all that surprising. As they walked, the traveler came upon a stream that wasn't quite water. It flowed gently, like a river made of silk, and when the traveler dipped their hand into it, they felt warmth, like the memory of a summer's day long past. The stream didn't make a sound, not the usual babbling or splashing, but more of a quiet hum, like the murmur of distant voices in a cozy room. The traveler considered following the stream, but then they remembered, or perhaps they forgot, that they were already following a path, so they continued on their way. A little further along, the traveler found a small bridge made of stone, though the stones were not just gray, but also purple and green, like moss-covered gems. The bridge arched over nothing in particular, just a patch of land that was slightly lower than the rest, but the traveler crossed it anyway. Halfway across, they paused and looked back, as if expecting to see something they had left behind. But the path behind them was empty, just as it was ahead. The traveler continued, humming a tune they couldn't quite remember learning. It was a melody that drifted in and out of their mind, much like the way the clouds drifted across the sky. Sometimes they were fluffy and white, and other times they were thin and stretched out, like threads of cotton caught on a breeze. The traveler liked the tune, even though they couldn't remember the words, or if there were any words at all. As they walked, the day began to change, though it wasn't clear if it was morning turning into afternoon, or afternoon slipping into evening. The light grew softer, and the air carried the scent of something sweet. Perhaps it was flowers, or maybe it was the smell of bread baking in a far-off kitchen. The traveler's stomach rumbled faintly, but the sound was more like a purr than anything else. They weren't sure if they were hungry or just content, and either way, it didn't seem to matter. The path took the traveler through a meadow filled with tall grasses that waved lazily in the breeze, like they were stretching after a long nap. Among the grasses were flowers that looked like stars, or perhaps they were stars that had decided to grow in the ground for a while. The traveler picked one, turning it over in their hand, and as they did, the petals seemed to shimmer and change colors. Blue, then pink, then a soft golden yellow, like the glow of a candle in a window on a dark night. The traveler tucked the flower behind their ear, though they weren't sure if they had an ear or if the flower just floated there on its own. It didn't matter, really. Things like that were normal when you were on a path that didn't always stay in one place. After a while, the traveler came to a fork in the road, or maybe it was a spoon. It was hard to tell because the road split into 3 or 4 or 5 different directions, and each path looked just as inviting as the next. One path was lined with trees that had silver bark and leaves shaped like teardrops. Another path was covered in soft moss, so green that it almost glowed. A third path seemed to lead into a forest, though the trees were more like tall ferns, with fronds that reached out to brush against the traveler's arm as they passed. The traveler stood there for a moment, trying to decide which way to go. But before they could make up their mind, a small creature appeared at their feet. It was a fox, or perhaps a rabbit. It had the ears of a rabbit, but the tail of a fox, and its fur was the color of twilight, that in-between shade that's not quite day and not quite night. The creature looked up at the traveler with eyes that were far too wise for such a small animal, and then it turned and started down the moss-covered path. The traveler followed, not because they had decided that was the way to go, but because the creature seemed to know something they didn't. The path was soft underfoot, and the air was filled with the sound of distant laughter, though there was no one else around. It was the kind of laughter you hear in dreams, just on the edge of your consciousness, making you feel warm and safe even if you don't know why. The creature led the traveler to a clearing where the ground was covered in soft golden light, as if the sun had decided to rest there for a while. In the center of the clearing was a tree, but it wasn't like any tree the traveler had seen before. Its trunk was wide, with bark that sparkled like it was covered in tiny crystals, and its branches spread out like the arms of an old friend, welcoming and kind. Hanging from the branches were lanterns, each one glowing with a soft light that flickered gently, as if in time with the traveler's heartbeat. The creature sat down at the base of the tree and looked up at the traveler, as if inviting them to do the same. The traveler hesitated for a moment, then sat down beside the creature. The ground was warm, and the traveler could feel the steady, comforting pulse of the earth beneath them, like a lullaby being sung by someone who had known them all their life. As the traveler sat there, they felt a sense of peace wash over them, a quiet contentment that came from deep within. The lanterns above swayed gently in the breeze, casting dancing shadows on the ground, and the traveler's eyes grew heavy. The creature curled up next to them, its soft fur brushing against the traveler's hand, and the traveler realized they were no longer worried about where they were going or where they had been. All that mattered was this moment, this quiet place where time seemed to stretch out, as soft and endless as the path they had been walking. The traveler closed their eyes, listening to the gentle rustling of the leaves, the distant hum of the stream, and the soft, rhythmic breathing of the creature beside them. The lanterns above them flickered and swayed, their light growing dimmer, and the world around the traveler began to fade, like the end of a dream slipping away as morning approaches. And as the traveler drifted off to sleep, they knew that the path would still be there when they woke, waiting to lead them on another journey, through fields of star-shaped flowers and forests of silver trees, across bridges of moss-covered stone, and past streams that flowed with the warmth of forgotten summer days. And maybe, just maybe, when they awoke, they would remember where they were going, or perhaps they would forget all over again. Chapter 2. The Lake of Whispering Echoes. The traveler awoke to the gentle sound of water lapping against the shore. They blinked slowly, their minds still hazy from the dreams that lingered just out of reach, like shadows on a foggy morning. As they sat up, they realized they were no longer in the golden clearing with the tree of lanterns. Instead, they found themselves on the edge of a vast, still lake. The surface of the water was so smooth that it looked like a sheet of glass, reflecting the sky above with perfect clarity. The sky was a deep indigo, dotted with stars that twinkled softly, though it wasn't quite night. Or perhaps it was dawn, with the faintest hint of light on the horizon, though it was hard to tell in this place where time seemed to stretch and fold like a piece of cloth. The traveler felt a sense of calm wash over them as they took in their surroundings. The air was cool and carried the faint scent of something sweet, like honeysuckle, or maybe it was the smell of rain that had yet to fall. They stood up slowly, brushing off the soft sand that clung to their clothes, and took a step towards the water. As their foot touched the edge of the lake, ripples spread out across the surface, disturbing the mirror-like reflection. But instead of fading, the ripples began to form patterns, circles within circles, spirals that seemed to spin and twist, creating shapes that looked almost like words. Or maybe they were notes of a song that had been forgotten long ago. The traveler watched, fascinated, as the patterns danced across the water, but they didn't quite understand what they were seeing. It was like trying to remember a story told to them as a child, familiar, yet just out of reach. They knelt by the water's edge, dipping their fingers into the cool lake. The ripples that followed their touch didn't feel like water, but more like silk, smooth and almost alive. And then, from somewhere deep within the lake, a sound began to emerge. It was a soft whisper at first, like the rustling of leaves in a gentle breeze. The traveler leaned in closer, trying to catch the words, but they were faint, like echoes of a conversation that had taken place long ago. "Come closer," the whisper seemed to say. The traveler hesitated, feeling a shiver run down their spine, not out of fear, but something more like curiosity mixed with the sense of stepping into a memory that wasn't their own. They took another step forward, and as they did, the landscape around them began to change. The sandy shore became smooth stones, and the trees that had lined the shore transformed into tall, slender willows, their branches hanging low over the water, as if they were reaching out to touch it. The stars in the sky grew brighter, their light reflecting off the water in long, shimmering trails. The traveler looked around, feeling as if they had stepped into another world, one that was both familiar and strange. The whispering from the lake grew louder, more distinct, and the traveler realized it wasn't just one voice, it was many. Soft, murmuring voices, all blending together, telling stories in a language that was just on the edge of understanding. They leaned closer to the water, and as they did, they saw something moving just beneath the surface. It was a figure, or perhaps many figures, though they were hard to make out in the shifting light. The traveler's heart quickened, not out of fear, but out of a deep, inexplicable need to understand what the lake was trying to tell them. The figures began to rise from the water, though they didn't break the surface. Instead, they remained just below, like reflections that didn't quite belong to anything. The traveler could see their faces now, vague, shadowy, but with eyes that glowed softly, like embers in a dying fire. The whispering grew louder, and the traveler realized the figures were speaking directly to them. "Do you remember?" one of the voices asked, though it wasn't a voice so much as a feeling, a thought that drifted into the traveler's mind like a leaf on the wind. "Remember what?" the traveler thought, but they didn't speak the words aloud. The lake seemed to hear them anyway, for the whispering continued, more insistent now. "Remember who you are. Remember where you're going." The traveler frowned, trying to recall, but the memories were slippery, like water slipping through their fingers. The lake rippled gently, and the figures beneath the surface began to move in a slow, rhythmic dance, their movements creating new patterns on the water. The traveler felt a pull, like the tide drawing them closer to the shore. They wanted to understand, to reach out and grasp the meaning of the whispers, but every time they got close, the words would scatter like dandelion seeds in the wind. The traveler stood there for what felt like hours, or maybe just a few moments. It was hard to tell. Time here was as fluid as the water itself, bending and twisting in ways that didn't quite make sense. Finally, the traveler sighed and stood up, stepping back from the water's edge. The whispers grew softer, fading into the background like a distant echo. The figures in the lake seemed to watch them, their glowing eyes following the traveler's every movement. The traveler knew they had to leave, though they weren't sure why. There was a sense of unfinished business, a question that hadn't been answered, but there was also a deep sense of peace, as if the lake had given them something, even if they didn't know what it was yet. As they turned to walk away, the traveler heard one last whisper, so faint that it was almost lost in the gentle breeze. "Come back when you're ready." The traveler paused, feeling the weight of those words, and then continued down the path that had appeared before them. The willows swayed gently in the breeze, their branches brushing against the traveler's shoulders as if bidding them farewell. The lake grew distant behind them, the whispers fading into silence. The path led the traveler through a forest, though it wasn't the same forest they had passed through before. This one was quieter, with trees that stood tall and still, their trunks covered in a soft, glowing moss. The air was cool, and the light filtering through the leaves was soft and golden, like the last light of day before twilight falls. The traveler walked on, feeling a sense of calm settling over them. The journey ahead was uncertain, the destination unknown, but there was no hurry. The path would lead them where they needed to go, in its own time, in its own way. And perhaps, when they were ready, they would return to the lake of whispering echoes to find the answers that had eluded them. But for now, the traveler was content to wander, to follow the path wherever it might lead, through forests of glowing moss, across meadows of star-shaped flowers, and beyond, into the dream that stretched out before them, as soft and endless as the night sky above. Chapter 3. The City of Silent Bells. The travelers' footsteps echoed softly as they walked along a path that had turned from soft earth to smooth cobblestone, each stone fitting perfectly against the next, as if they had been laid down with care by unseen hands. The air around them began to change, carrying with it a faint, metallic scent, like rain after a long dry spell, though the sky above was clear, a deep shade of twilight blue. As they continued, the trees that had lined the path slowly gave way to tall buildings, their walls made of stone that glimmered faintly in the dim light. The traveler realized they had entered a city, though it wasn't like any city they had seen before. The streets were empty, yet not deserted. It felt as though the inhabitants had just stepped away for a moment, leaving behind a quiet, serene stillness. The buildings rose high above, their windows dark and silent, but there was no sense of abandonment. Instead, the city felt alive in a different way, like a memory or a dream, half remembered and half forgotten. The traveler walked on, their footsteps the only sound in the stillness, until they came to a large square in the center of the city. In the middle of the square stood a tall tower, reaching up towards the sky, its spire topped with a weathered bell that glowed faintly in the fading light. The tower was ancient, its stone worn smooth by time, and around its base were carvings, stories etched into the stone, though the traveler couldn't make out the details. It was as if the stories had been eroded by the wind, or perhaps by the slow passing of countless years. The traveler stood there, looking up at the bell, and noticed something strange. Though the bell looked heavy, as if it would take a great force to move it, it was swaying gently, as if caught by a breeze that couldn't be felt. But there was no sound. The bell moved in silence, its deep, resonant tones somehow muted, as if it were ringing in another world, just out of reach. Drawn by a sense of curiosity, or perhaps by the feeling that they had been here before, in another time, another life, the traveler approached the tower. As they did, the carvings on the stone became clearer, though they were still faint, like a story told in whispers. The traveler reached out, tracing the lines with their fingers, and as they did, the stories began to unfold in their mind. The carvings told of a city that once rang with the sound of bells, hundreds of them, all singing in harmony, their voices echoing through the streets, filling every corner with music. The bells had names, though the traveler couldn't remember them, and each one had a unique tone, a note that blended perfectly with the others to create a symphony that never ceased. The people of the city had lived their lives to the rhythm of the bells, rising and resting with the music that filled the air. But one day, the traveler didn't know when or how the bells had fallen silent. The carvings didn't say why, only that the silence had come like a shadow, spreading through the city until all that was left was the memory of the music that once was. The people had tried to bring the bells back to life, but their efforts were in vain. The silence remained, and the city slowly faded into the quiet place it was now, a place where the bells still moved, but their voices could no longer be heard. The traveler felt a pang of sorrow for the people of the city, for the loss of the music that had once filled their lives. But as they stood there, the silence of the city began to feel less like emptiness and more like a different kind of music, a soft, quiet song that could only be heard by those who truly listened. As they looked up at the silent bell, the traveler felt a sudden urge to climb the tower. They weren't sure why. Perhaps it was the thought of seeing the city from above. Or maybe it was the hope that at the top they might find a way to hear the bells again. Without hesitation, they began to ascend the narrow stone steps that spiraled up inside the tower. The climb was long, the steps worn smooth by the passage of many feet over the years. The air grew cooler as they ascended, and the light from the windows that lined the tower grew softer, taking on a golden hue that reminded the traveler of late afternoon sunshine. As they climbed, they thought they could hear something, a faint sound, like the echo of a bell in the distance. Though it was so quiet, they couldn't be sure if it was real or just their imagination. Finally, the traveler reached the top of the tower, stepping out onto a small platform that overlooked the city below. The view was breathtaking. The city stretched out in all directions, its streets winding like rivers of stone. And beyond the city walls, the forest they had left behind could be seen, a dark line on the horizon. But it was the bell that held the traveler's attention. Up close, it was even more impressive, massive and ancient, with a surface that was smooth and cool to the touch. The bell was still swaying gently, though the traveler could feel no wind. They reached out, placing a hand on the side of the bell, and as they did, a strange sensation washed over them, like a wave of warmth and sadness all at once, a feeling that was both comforting and melancholy. And then, as the traveler stood there, something miraculous happened. The bell, which had been silent for so long, began to ring. The sound was soft at first, just a whisper of a note, but it grew louder, richer, filling the air with a deep, resonant tone that seemed to echo through the very fabric of the city. The traveler closed their eyes, letting the sound wash over them, feeling it vibrate through their bones, through the stones of the tower, through the streets below. As the bell rang, the city seemed to come alive. The windows of the buildings lit up with a soft, golden light, and the streets below filled with the faintest hint of movement, shadows that flickered and danced, like the memory of the people who had once lived there. The traveler felt a tear slip down their cheek, though they didn't know why. The sound of the bell was so beautiful, so haunting, that it seemed to fill every corner of their soul. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, the sound faded, the bell growing silent once more. The city below returned to its quiet state, the lights in the windows dimming, the shadows disappearing. The traveler stood there for a long moment, listening to the echoes of the bell that still lingered in the air, even though the bell itself had gone quiet. Finally, they turned to leave, descending the tower steps with a sense of peace they hadn't felt before. The city was silent once more, But the traveler knew that the bell's song was not lost. It lived on in the echoes, in the quiet spaces between the stones, in the hearts of those who had heard it. As the traveler stepped out of the tower and back into the square, they took one last look at the bell high above. The city was still, the buildings tall and silent, but the traveler knew that the silence was not empty. It was full of memories, of stories, of a music that could still be heard if you listened closely enough. The traveler smiled softly and turned away, walking down a cobblestone street that led out of the city. The path before them was new, unfamiliar, but they were not afraid. The journey would continue, and wherever it led, the echoes of the silent bells would follow, a reminder of the beauty that could be found in even the quietest places. And so, with the city of silent bells behind them, the traveler walked on, their steps light, their heart full, ready for whatever lay ahead. Chapter 4: The Garden of Forgotten Dreams. The traveler's journey continued, the cobblestone streets of the silent city fading into a gentle path of soft earth and wildflowers. The air grew warmer, carrying with it the scent of blooming jasmine and the sweet undertones of ripe fruit. The sky above transitioned from the deep indigo of twilight to a soft, rosy pink, as if the dawn was approaching, though the sun remained hidden just below the horizon. As the traveler walked, they noticed the landscape beginning to change once again. The path led them through a grove of ancient trees, their trunks thick and gnarled, their branches entwined overhead to form a natural archway. The leaves were a deep emerald green, and they rustled softly in the breeze, creating a melody that was soothing and familiar, though the traveler couldn't quite place where they had heard it before. Emerging from the grove, the traveler found themselves standing at the entrance to a garden. It was unlike any garden they had ever seen, sprawling and wild, yet carefully tended in places where order seemed necessary. The air was thick with the fragrance of flowers, roses, lilacs, and blossoms of colors the traveler had no names for. The garden stretched out before them, a labyrinth of paths winding through beds of flowers, towering hedges, and quiet ponds that reflected the soft light of the sky above. The traveler stepped into the garden, feeling the soft grass beneath their feet. As they wandered through the pathways, they noticed something curious. Each section of the garden seemed to evoke a different feeling, a different memory. One path led through a field of daisies that reminded the traveler of childhood summers, full of laughter and endless days of play. Another path wound through a thicket of tall, slender trees whose leaves whispered secrets of long-forgotten dreams. The traveler felt as though they were walking through their own memories, though they couldn't quite remember if these were their memories or someone else's. The garden seemed alive with the echoes of the past, each flower, each tree, holding a fragment of a story that had once been important but had since faded into the background. As they wandered deeper into the garden, the traveler came across a small pond, its surface perfectly still, like a mirror reflecting the sky. Floating on the water were delicate lilies, their petals soft and white, glowing faintly in the dim light. The traveler knelt by the edge of the pond, gazing into the water, and saw something that took their breath away. Beneath the surface of the pond were images, scenes from dreams, dreams that the traveler had forgotten long ago. They saw themselves as a child, running through a field of golden wheat, the sun warm on their face. They saw a place that felt like home, though they couldn't remember where it was, or if it had ever existed outside of their dreams. They saw faces, some familiar, others strangers, all smiling, all welcoming. The traveler reached out to touch the surface of the water, and as their fingers brushed against it, the images rippled and changed. Now, they saw a different dream, one of flying through a sky filled with stars, the wind rushing past them, carrying them higher and higher until the stars were within reach. They saw a dream of a quiet room, lit by a single candle, where they sat at a table with someone they loved, though they couldn't remember who it was. The dream was filled with a sense of peace, of belonging, and the traveler felt a tear slip down their cheek. The garden was a place of forgotten dreams, dreams that had once meant everything, but had been lost to the passage of time. The traveler realized that this garden was not just a place of memories, but a place of possibilities, dreams that could be remembered, reclaimed, and perhaps even lived again. As they stood up from the pond, the traveler noticed a small path leading away from the water, winding through a grove of trees whose leaves shimmered like silver. They followed the path, feeling a sense of purpose, though they didn't know where it would lead. The air was filled with the sound of soft music, though there were no instruments to be seen, just the gentle rustling of leaves and the distant call of a nightingale. The path led them to a clearing in the heart of the garden, where a large stone fountain stood. The fountain was old, its surface covered in moss, but the water that flowed from it was clear and bright, sparkling in the light. Around the fountain were benches made of smooth stone, and on one of the benches sat an old woman. The woman was dressed in flowing robes of deep blue, her hair white as snow, her eyes bright and clear. She looked up as the traveler approached and smiled, a smile that was both welcoming and knowing, as if she had been expecting them. "Welcome," she said, in a voice that was soft and warm, like a blanket on a cold night. "You've come a long way, haven't you?" The traveler nodded, though they weren't sure how to answer. The woman gestured for them to sit beside her, and the traveler did, feeling a sense of calm settle over them. "This garden," the woman said, "is a place where dreams come to rest. The dreams we forget, the dreams we lose along the way, they all find their way here. Some are old and faded. Others are still bright and full of life, waiting to be remembered." The traveler looked around at the garden, understanding now why it felt so familiar, so full of memories. "Why am I here?" the traveler asked, their voice quiet. The woman smiled again, her eyes twinkling with a light that seemed to come from within. "You are here because you needed to remember," she said. "We all forget from time to time. The world is full of distractions, full of noise, and it's easy to lose sight of the dreams that once guided us. This garden is a place to remember, to find those dreams again, and to take them with you when you leave." The traveler thought about the dreams they had seen in the pond, the dreams they had forgotten. Some were dreams of the past, of things that had been, but others were dreams of the future, of things that could still be. The woman stood up, her movements graceful and fluid. She reached out and placed a hand on the traveler's shoulder, her touch gentle but firm. "Take your time," she said. "The garden will be here as long as you need it. When you're ready, you'll know which dream to take with you." With that, the woman turned and walked away, disappearing into the trees, leaving the traveler alone by the fountain. The traveler sat there for a long time, listening to the sound of the water, the soft music that filled the air, and the whispers of the dreams that surrounded them. Finally, the traveler stood up and walked back to the pond. They looked into the water again, seeing the dreams that lay beneath the surface, each one waiting, patient and still. The traveler reached down and touched the water, and as they did, one of the dreams rose to meet them. It was a dream of hope, of new beginnings, and as the traveler held it in their hand, they felt a warmth spread through them, filling them with a sense of purpose. The traveler smiled and tucked the dream into their heart, knowing that it would guide them on the path ahead. They turned away from the pond, from the garden of forgotten dreams, and walked back to the entrance. As they left the garden, the path stretched out before them, winding through the trees and into the distance. The traveler didn't know where it would lead, but they weren't worried. They had a dream to guide them now, a dream that had been forgotten, but was now remembered, bright and full of life. And so, with a light heart and a clear mind, the traveler continued their journey, leaving the garden behind, but carrying its memories, its dreams, with them. The path ahead was full of possibilities, full of new adventures, and the traveler was ready to face them, with hope in their heart and a dream to guide their way. Chapter 5: The Valley of Resonant Winds. The traveler's path took an unexpected turn. Where once there had been a gentle garden, now there was a vast expanse of shimmering glass-like sand, stretching out in all directions, glinting under a sky that had no clear color. Perhaps it was silver, perhaps a shade of soft lavender, or maybe something else entirely, like the color of a thought that had just begun to form. As the traveler walked, the ground beneath their feet began to pulse with a slow, rhythmic beat, as if the very earth were breathing. The sand didn't shift or stir as one might expect. Instead, it rippled, like the surface of a pond disturbed by a single drop of water. Each step sent concentric circles spreading outward, the waves merging and dissolving into each other, creating patterns too intricate to comprehend fully. In the distance, there were towering structures, though not buildings, more like colossal, twisting pillars made of woven wind. They rose high into the sky, spiraling and curling in on themselves, yet they remained still, as if frozen in the midst of a dance. The traveler could feel them before they reached them, a faint hum in the air that resonated with something deep inside, like the echo of a forgotten song. The traveler approached one of these pillars, reaching out a tentative hand. The air around it was thick, almost tangible, like walking through a dream just before waking. As their fingers brushed against the surface, the wind within the pillar seemed to stir, sending a shiver down the traveler's spine. A low, melodic note hummed through the air, vibrating through their very bones. Suddenly, the pillars began to sing, not in any language known to the traveler, but in a series of tones and echoes that filled the vast space around them. The sound was haunting, like a chorus of voices from another time, each note a memory of something long past. It wasn't music as the traveler knew it, but it was beautiful, and it drew them closer, deeper into the valley. The traveler followed the sound, which grew richer and more complex the further they went. The wind began to move now, but not as a simple breeze. It carried whispers and sighs, fragments of words, ideas, emotions, all swirling together in a cacophony of almost meaning. The traveler felt the wind tug at them, as if urging them to listen, to understand. But the wind wasn't just singing, it was telling a story. The traveler could feel it, the way the air shifted and pulsed with each note, each gust. It was a story of the valley itself, a place where the wind was born, where it learned to speak and sing, carrying with it the tales of all who had passed through, and even those who had never been. And then, as the traveler stood in the midst of the valley, the wind began to shape itself into forms, shadows and figures made of swirling air and light. They danced around the traveler, moving in and out of focus, each one a fleeting glimpse of a memory or a dream. There was a figure that looked like a bird made of smoke, its wings beating in time with the wind's song. Another figure was more like a giant made of mist, tall and silent, its eyes glowing faintly like distant stars. These figures didn't speak directly, but their presence communicated 1,000 things at once: longing, joy, sorrow, love, all the emotions that the wind had ever carried. The traveler felt overwhelmed, but not in a frightening way. It was as though they were being shown the essence of the world, the way everything was connected by the unseen forces that flowed through this valley. One figure, more distinct than the others, approached the traveler. It was neither man nor woman, neither young nor old. It simply was. It reached out with a hand made of wind and light, and as it touched the traveler, a surge of images filled their mind. The traveler saw places they had never been, people they had never met, but all felt as familiar as their own memories. They saw mountains that sang with the voices of ancient stones, rivers that flowed backward, carrying the past into the future, and forests where each tree held the secrets of the stars. The figure's touch was gentle but insistent, as if asking the traveler a question, though the traveler didn't know what the question was. Still, they felt an answer forming within them, a deep understanding that words couldn't quite capture. It was as if the wind itself was asking them to become part of its story, to let go of everything they knew, and become one with the ever-changing, ever-moving forces of the valley. And for a moment, the traveler considered it. They could feel the pull, the temptation to let go, to dissolve into the wind and become something more than themselves, something eternal and boundless. But then, a memory surfaced, sharp and clear. The dream they had taken from the garden, the dream that still rested in their heart, warm and full of life. The traveler smiled, softly but firmly, and shook their head. The figure of wind and light seemed to understand. It nodded, a slow and graceful movement, and stepped back, allowing the traveler to hold on to their dream, their sense of self. The other figures, too, began to fade, their forms dissolving into the air, leaving behind only the soft, echoing song of the wind. The valley grew quiet again, the wind's song fading into a gentle breeze that caressed the traveler's face. The pillars of woven wind still stood tall, but now they were silent, their dance completed, their story told. The traveler felt a deep sense of peace, as though they had been given a gift a glimpse into something vast and unknowable, yet intimately connected to the very fabric of existence. With a final look at the towering pillars, the traveler turned and began to walk away, the path before them reappearing as if it had always been there, waiting. The wind whispered one last note, a soft, lingering echo that followed the traveler as they left the valley behind. As they walked, the traveler felt the dream within them, the one they had chosen in the garden, growing stronger, more vivid. It was their own story, their own path, and it was waiting to be written, shaped by the winds of their journey and the choices they would make. And so, with the valley of echoing winds behind them, the traveler moved forward, ready to face whatever lay ahead, knowing that they carried the echoes of countless stories within them, each one a part of the endless, ever-changing song of the world. Chapter 6: The Edge of Time and Space. The traveler left the valley of resonant winds behind, stepping onto a path that seemed to stretch out endlessly before them. The ground beneath their feet was no longer the familiar earth or sand, but something softer, almost like walking on the surface of a quiet, shimmering pool. The horizon ahead was blurred, as if it couldn't quite decide where it wanted to be, and the sky above was a strange, colorless void, neither day nor night, but something in between. As the traveler moved forward, they began to notice subtle changes in the world around them. The air grew thinner, the light dimmer, and the path itself seemed to lose its solidity, wavering and shifting like the reflections on water. The traveler's steps became lighter, as if they were walking on the edge of a dream, where reality and imagination mingled and blurred. Time began to lose its meaning. Moments stretched into hours, and hours into something else entirely, something that defied all understanding. The traveler could no longer tell if they had been walking for minutes or days. The concept of time began to slip away, leaving only the soft, rhythmic sound of their breath and the steady beating of their heart. The path eventually dissolved into nothingness, leaving the traveler standing on the edge of an endless expanse. There was no up or down, no forward or back, just a vast, open space that seemed to go on forever, filled with soft, pulsing light. The traveler felt a sense of weightlessness, as if they were floating in a place where the laws of physics no longer applied. They reached out a hand, but there was nothing to grasp, nothing to hold on to. The space around them was empty, yet full of possibilities, full of potential, full of the quiet hum of the universe itself. It was a place where time had no meaning, where the past, present, and future existed all at once, interwoven like the threads of a vast cosmic tapestry. The traveler drifted through this space, feeling a sense of calm, yet also a deep, profound awe. They were at the very edge of existence, where everything and nothing converged. They saw glimpses of stars being born, galaxies swirling in their slow, majestic dance, and black holes pulling everything into their silent embrace. It was a place beyond time, beyond space, where the boundaries of the universe itself seemed to blur and fade. As they floated, the traveler began to lose their sense of self. They became one with the space around them, their thoughts mingling with the soft, whispering echoes of the cosmos. They felt the pull of distant stars, the gentle tug of gravity, the endless expansion of the universe carrying them further and further into the unknown. There was no fear, only a deep, abiding peace. The traveler's consciousness expanded, touching the farthest reaches of space, brushing against the edge of time itself. They felt connected to everything, to the stars, the planets, the very fabric of reality. They were a part of it all, and yet they were also nothing more than a single point of light in the vast expanse. Time continued to stretch, to bend and twist, until it became something unrecognizable, something that no longer mattered. The traveler's memories began to blur, to fade, until they were nothing more than distant echoes. The dream they had carried from the garden, the stories they had heard in the valley of resonant winds, all began to dissolve, melting away into the infinite space around them. And then, just as they felt they might dissolve entirely into the void, something changed. A flicker of light, a distant sound, something small, yet powerful, began to pull the traveler back. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the space around them began to shift, to contract, bringing them back to a sense of self, of being. The traveler felt the ground beneath their feet once more, solid and real. The light around them began to take on color. The air grew thicker, and time slowly resumed its steady march. The endless expanse faded into the background, becoming just a memory, a faint echo in the traveler's mind. As the traveler stood there, at the very edge of time and space, they realized they had been to a place few had ever seen, a place where the universe itself had shown them its secrets. And though the experience had left them changed, they knew they had to continue their journey, to follow the path that had reappeared before them. With a deep breath, the traveler turned and began to walk once more, leaving the edge of time and space behind. The path stretched out before them, solid and sure, leading them to the next part of their journey, whatever that might be. And though they had touched the very limits of existence, they knew there was still more to explore, more to discover, more to dream. And so, with a heart full of wonder and a mind full of infinite possibilities, the traveler continued on, ready to face whatever lay ahead in the ever-unfolding tapestry of the universe. Thank you for joining me on this journey through the realms of dreams and the edges of imagination here at Mumblebee. As our traveler continues their wandering, may you find your own path to restful sleep, where the whispers of stories guide you gently into the night. Until next time, let your dreams carry you to places where time and space have no hold, and where every step brings you closer to the peaceful rest you deserve. Sleep well and sweet dreams.